last time I talked about the connection between Escher's artwork and mathematics, and in particular the mathematics in the periodic tilings of the plane that Escher does a lot of work in. This time I'm going to do something different. I'm going to talk about Escher's more playful prints and basically explain how he plays with perception, with our perceptions of what he's drawn, okay, using what's called ambiguous perspective and impossible figures, okay. So this is more art than math, you know, comparing this talk to the last talk. But I'm going to be sort of breaking down or analyzing Escher's artwork as a scientist would. Okay, so I'm going to sort of take things apart. Now, this is meant to be a very informal talk, okay, so please interrupt and ask me questions at any time. I'm going to try to get as much interaction from you as I can throughout the talk. Okay, now for those of you who weren't here for Escher Part 1, here's a brief biography of Escher the person. So MC stands for Maurits Cornelis. He was born in 1898 and died in 1972 at the age of 73. He was a Dutch graphic artist and produced over 400 prints over the course of his lifetime. Okay, his work was in woodcuts and lithographs. So he didn't do sort of charcoal drawings or paintings. He did woodcuts. This is a self-portrait of his, which is a woodcut, and lithographs, which are basically etchings in stone. Okay, so rather unforgiving media in which to work. He's most noted for his periodic tilings of the plane and various representations of infinity. That's what I talked about last semester, and the connection to the mathematics behind that. He's also noted for the use of ambiguous perspective and the depiction of impossible objects to play with perception. Okay, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on this time. Okay, so here's a quote from Escher, which I'd like to read. Drawing is deception. It suggests 3 dimensions when there are but 2. And no matter how hard I try to convince you about this deception, you persist in seeing 3-dimensional objects. Okay? And that's basically the key of this whole talk. Okay? That there's this fundamental ambiguity in interpreting what we see on a 2-dimensional piece of paper as 3-dimensional objects that live in 3-dimensional space. Okay? And Escher will often make use of this ambiguity in order to trick us, the viewer, when we're looking at some of his prints. So to illustrate this, here's a picture, if you will. Okay, it's just a line. Okay, there's a simple line drawn on the page. Okay, and the question is, what is this supposed to represent? Okay, what is the object that this line is supposed to represent here? Is it representing this 3-dimensional object, just a short stick that you see lengthwise like this? Or is it a longer stick like this that you see at an angle from perspective, okay, that projects the same length horizontally? Or is it something even different? It's not a stick at all. It's a circular disc, but you only see it edge on, okay? All of these are possibilities, okay? So that's the ambiguity that I'm talking about. You can't, from this simple line, say what the 3-dimensional object is. I guess it's an obvious thing once you think about it, but I think it's important to make that statement nonetheless. So what I want to do in this talk is basically give you first an art lesson, if you will, in linear perspective, how people draw in such a way that they represent realistically 3-dimensional objects on a 2-dimensional page. And then spend the remainder of the talk describing different ambiguities in perception that exist. And I'll focus on 3 different ambiguities. One called relative perspective, the other called perspective reversal, and then the last is using impossible objects to play with our perception. And hopefully these things will be clear as we go along. But don't hesitate to ask questions if you have them. Okay, so let's start with linear perspective. So here's a painting by of the Annunciation by Simone Martini in 1333. Okay, look at it for a second or two. Okay, pay attention to it. This is a painting, a fresco by Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper, in 1498, roughly 150 years later. If you compare the two, what difference do you see? What's most obvious to you in regard to these two different paintings, one by Martini and the other by da Vinci? Do you see anything that's fundamentally different? Yes?
The da Vinci painting has a lot more depth, you can tell.
Okay, so there's more depth in this particular painting here. It's three-dimensional. You can feel some volume, whereas in the Martini painting of the Annunciation, the figures are rather flat. Okay, they're two-dimensional as opposed to the three-dimensional figures in the Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper. Okay. Now, this idea of depth, or giving the illusion of depth in a painting or a drawing, is best illustrated, I think, by this print of Escher's called Depth, appropriately, in 1955. And it's basically a school of fish, if you will, or submarines, or whatever you want to think of these, okay? All the same size, swimming in formation, sort of like soldiers in an army, okay? Now, what do you see here? How does this illustrate depth, okay? Well, there are certain depth cues that are used, okay, to highlight the three-dimensionality that's illustrated here. The first is overlapping the figures. The figures that are closer to us overlap those in the distance, right? So we know that this fish here is in front of these fish because it overlaps them. So that's a simple way that you can give the illusion of depth on the two-dimensional page. The other depth cue that's used here is sharpness versus fuzziness, okay? The figures, the fish that are closer to us are more well-defined. You can see the details much more clearly, whereas the fish in the background are more fuzzy. They're hazy, okay? And that's because there's water or atmosphere, if you will, in between this fish and that fish over there. It's sometimes called atmospheric perspective in the art field, okay? And then the third is that even though these objects, these fish, all have the same size in the real three-dimensional space, they diminish in size as they recede from us, the viewer, as they recede in the distance, okay? So this fish here is bigger than this fish here, is bigger than this fish here, is bigger than that fish there in the drawing, even though in real life, right, they're all the same size. So that diminishing of size as you go back, as the object recedes from us, is another way of illustrating depth, okay? And this last depth cue is used as a fundamental aspect of perspective drawing. Another thing that you might see, which shows up in perspective drawing, is that if you draw lines which are parallel in three-dimensional space, so lines that go through the individual sort of rows of fish, if you draw lines through those rows, those lines don't intersect in three-dimensional space, right? Because parallel lines don't intersect. However, they intersect here on the two-dimensional page at this thing called a vanishing point, okay? So the idea that parallel lines in space converge as they recede from the viewer is another important aspect of perspective drawing. And we'll see that a lot, okay? I'll draw a lot of parallel lines that intersect at vanishing points. Now, this idea of perspective drawing was formalized by two real Renaissance men, Filippo Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti, okay, around the beginning of the 1400s, okay? And Alberti actually wrote a book where he describes this idea of perspective drawing. He sort of lays out all of the details. in this book called On Painting, written in 1435. And if you want, you can get a Penguin classic of it and read the translated version. It was written in Latin and then translated. But the basic idea of linear perspective is just this. Here's an object, say, that you want to represent, this three-dimensional object, a cube. And here you are, the artist, okay? So what you do is you imagine looking at that object through a flat two-dimensional surface, a two-dimensional piece of glass, if you will. And then you look at where the rays of light go from the object to your eye, where they intersect the piece of glass. And then you basically just faithfully represent on this piece of glass the point where, where this ray of light goes through the glass. You make a mark, okay? So let me show you here. So you've got these two edges here of the cube. If you follow the rays of light here, D and A here, they enter the eye of the artist, and they would cut through the glass, intersect the glass here. Similarly, this edge from B to C, the rays of light would intersect the glass here, okay? And if you continue those lines, extend those lines off, they meet at a vanishing point, okay? Because these are parallel lines in space that are receding from the viewer, from the artist here. So they must intersect at a vanishing point, which is at the eye level of the artist, okay? And you basically do that for all edges of the object that you're looking at. So here I show two other edges in blue and two other edges in green. Okay? And I can illustrate this very simply. You can do this at home. Okay? You can make your own realistic perspective drawing. So you get an object like this, or I could even do one of you. Okay? And you take basically a piece of glass and you just set it up, okay, in such a way that it doesn't, move, okay? And then you just look through the glass, have your little marker, and wherever you see wherever you see the object on the glass, you just trace it out. And you try not to move your head. Keep your head fixed. So you're basically observing this from one point, and you draw the cube, okay? And then this cube is basically the perspective drawing representation of that. And if I continued these lines back, they would meet at a vanishing point, etc. Okay? So that's what you can do. So I could even draw you if I wanted. I just basically look very, I just pay attention to what I see, and then I just mark what I see. That's it. That's how perspective drawing is done. Now, an artist doesn't do that on a piece of glass. He or she does that on a piece of paper or on a canvas, but effectively that's what's being done, okay? And Alberti's formal treatment of perspective drawing basically just formalizes what I showed you there. Okay, so let's talk about vanishing points a little bit more. Here's a photo of railroad tracks. Railroad tracks are parallel, right? You draw lines along those railroad tracks, and they meet here at a vanishing point, which lies on the horizon. Okay, I think people have seen this before. Now, if you lie on your back on the sidewalk in New York City or some city with lots of skyscrapers, you would see something like that. Again, you can draw lines that are parallel in space along the edges of the building, right? They would just go vertically upward, but they meet here at a vanishing point, which is not on the horizon, but it's directly above. So that's the so-called zenith point, okay? And then you can take the opposite point of view. So this is a photo taken by somebody standing on stairs. I think this is like a water tower or something. Okay, you can see the stairs here, some sort of tall tower, and he's standing here and took the photo. And again, if you draw lines parallel to you draw lines along the structure here, okay, which are parallel in space, They meet here at a vanishing point, which is directly below. So this is a so-called nadir point. So you've got zenith above, nadir below, and horizon on the horizon. So now if we go back to the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, and we draw lines defined by the room here that are all parallel in the three-dimensional space, you see that those lines, not coincidentally, right, meet at the head of Christ. Okay? And that's a trick, if you will, that artists use to draw the viewer's attention to something that they want you to focus on. Okay? Your eye is naturally led toward, toward the vanishing point, and Da Vinci put the vanishing point here, or put Christ at the vanishing point. Okay? And note that Da Vinci did this painting in 1498, which was after Alberti formalized the ideas underlying perspective drawing. Okay, so Da Vinci was well aware of doing perspective drawing. So this was not by chance. This was done purposefully. Now, the number of vanishing points that a particular object has depends on how it sits relative to the picture plane. Okay, so if you have the picture plane like this, and you've got an object like this, well, it depends if the object is oriented like this, or if it's rotated or tilted, etc. Okay? If it has one face parallel to the picture plane, there's going to be only one set of lines that recede from the picture plane and meet at a single vanishing point. If you now rotate the cube relative to the picture plane, so that only these edges here are parallel to the picture plane, you've got two sets of parallel lines now that meet at two vanishing points. And then if you tilt the object in addition to rotate it, you find that you get three vanishing points. Okay? For this object here, there are no edges of the cube that are parallel to the picture plane. Okay? And here's a nice print of Escher's that shows this three-point perspective for a building, okay, the Tower of Babel. Okay? And you see here that if I just draw lines along certain edges of the building, okay, those lines go back and meet at a vanishing point here on the horizon. The blue lines go back and meet at a vanishing point again on the horizon in that direction. And then these lines here extend down, meet at a vanishing point below. Okay, that's the nadir point. So this is an example of a three-point perspective. Okay, so that's your lesson, if you will, on perspective drawing. That's the art lesson. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about different ambiguities in perception and how Escher uses those in order to trick us when we look at some of his artwork. Okay? And we're going to look at three different things, remember, the first being what I call relative perspective. Okay, so this is a print of Escher's called Another World 2. Okay, and if you look here, there's this figure. It looks like a bird, but it has a human face. Okay, I'll call it a bird, even though it's not a bird. Okay, you see a lunar-like landscape in the background. You see the night sky with the stars and planets and galaxies and all sorts of things in the background. And actually, you see three of these. Okay, you see this bird here, another bird, and another bird. Okay. And there's this structure. I don't know if it's a building that has, these pillars and these openings. Okay. Now, if you stare at it for a while, do you see these as three different birds or the same bird? Okay. I see it as the same bird, but looked at sort of three different ways. Okay. Okay, so here we're looking at the bird face on. Here we're looking sort of from below. And here we're looking from above. Okay? So we're looking at this scene from three different perspectives, okay? But it's all represented on a single sort of drawing, a single image here. Now it's not perfect, of course, because if you look up at the bird here, then this cornucopia is on the left of the bird, but this is on the right of the bird, okay? But you have to give Escher the artistic freedom to do what he's doing here, okay? So I think what's being represented is a single bird, single landscape, single night sky in a building, but you see three different views, okay? And if you draw, and I'm going to do this a lot, if you draw these lines defined by the building, they're parallel lines in space. Again, they meet at a vanishing point over here. But what is that vanishing point? Is it a horizon point? Is it a zenith point? Is it a nadir point? Okay. Well, the answer is it depends. Okay. Because if we just focus on this part of the print, you see that this lies on the horizon. So that vanishing point is a horizon point. Okay. If instead I look at this part of the print here, these lines meet up here directly overhead the bird, so it's a zenith point. Okay. And then if we close off everything else and just look here at the remaining part of the print, and you look at where these lines meet, they meet directly below that bird, which is the nadir point. Okay? So here's the full print again, and what you see is that this vanishing point here plays three different roles. It's either a horizon point, a zenith point, or a nadir point, depending on what part of the print you're looking at. So that's what I meant by relative perspective. Okay, what this vanishing point is over here depends on which sort of perspective you're interpreting what you're seeing. Okay. Now here's a slightly more complicated version that illustrates the same thing. Okay. If you look here, it's the inside of some building, I think. Lots of staircases. Okay. You can see outside the building, there's somebody sitting on at a table, picnic table. Again, you can see outside through the building here some trees. You see a planter here. Okay. Oops, sorry. But there are three types of figures. Okay, there are those figures that are upright, that are more or less vertical. Okay, which I highlight here in blue. There are figures that lean to the left, so-called left leaners, okay, which I highlight here in red. Okay. And there are figures that lean to the right, which I highlight here in green. So there are these three different types of figures all inhabiting the same scene here. Okay, so this is different than the Another World print that I showed you earlier, where it was basically just one bird seen from three different perspectives. Here you've got three different types of figures. Okay. Now, if you draw again lines parallel, along the lines of the, if you draw lines defined by the building, you see that some of the lines, okay, meet at a vanishing point way up there. Okay. Some of the other lines, these dashed lines, meet over here, a vanishing point over here, and then the dotted lines meet at a vanishing point down here somewhere. But what those vanishing points are depend on which set of figures you're talking about. So for example, if we look at the vanishing point that goes way up, through the roof here, you see that it's a zenith point for the blue figures, right? It's directly above the blue figures, so it's a zenith point. But for the green figures leaning to the right and the red figures leaning to the left, that vanishing point is actually a horizon point. It lies on their horizon. Okay? So again, you've got a single vanishing point playing three different roles, either a zenith point, a horizon point, or another horizon point, depending on which figures you're talking about. Similarly here, if you look at the vanishing point that goes off to the right over here, that becomes a horizon point for the green figures. okay? It becomes a horizon point as well for the upright blue figures, but it's directly below the left-leaning red figures, okay? So the vanishing point over here, again, is playing three different roles, and similarly, if you do a similar analysis for this vanishing point, you see that it's different depending on whether you're talking about the green figures, the blue figures, or the red figures, okay? So again, Escher is using this relativeness of the vanishing point in playing with our view of it. And it's rather interesting, I think, to consider the people on the staircase, okay? So for example, you've got this blue figure walking down the staircase here. Underneath the staircase, you've got a green figure which is also walking down it. So one is walking down the sort of the top of the staircase, the other one is walking down it underneath. They're both moving downward. But if you look at these two figures here on this staircase, okay, the red figure and the green figure, they're both moving in this direction, to the right. But the green figure is going what? Up or down? Up. And the red figure is going down. Okay, so the red figure is going down the staircase, the green figure is going up the staircase, but nonetheless it's the same staircase. Okay, so there's something screwy, right, going on with this particular print here, but it's very nicely done, right? Escher does it in a very subtle way. There isn't any sort of abruptness in the way he represents things. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say in regard to relative perspective, the fact that vanishing points can play, can represent different things, horizon, zenith, or nadir, depending on the perspective that's used. Now I want to talk about perspective reversal, which is related but slightly different. So this is something that probably you've all seen before. Okay, what do you see? Well, you see faces. Okay, you could see faces, or you could see what?
Candelabra.
Excuse me?
Candelabra.
A candelabra or vase. Okay, so let's call it a vase or faces. Okay, and it depends on what you take as the figure and what you take as the ground or the background. Right, so you can take your figure to be this white vase on a black background, or you can take your figures to be these black faces on a white background. Okay? Now, can you see both of those at the same time? Can you see both the vase strongly and the faces at the same time, or can you only sort of have one interpretation of it at a time? I find the same thing, that you can only interpret what it's only possible to see one of those interpretations at a time. Okay, your mind has to flip-flop back and forth in order to see, say, first the vase and then the faces. Okay, so that's what I mean by perspective reversal, that you're reversing from a perspective where the vase is the figure on a black background to the other case where you've got black faces on a white background. Okay. Here's another representation of this. Okay. So these are some footprints, or photos of some footprints. Do you see these as convex, so things that stick out? Or do you see them as sticking in, going in? Do you see them as little hills or as holes? Hills, okay. Do other people see them? I mean, that's what I see these as little hills, little mounds, okay? Now, what about this? Obviously in, okay, so she says in, okay? Do other people see these as, footprints in the sand, in little gullies, that would collect water, okay? Now, those two photos are exactly the same photo. It's just that I turned one photo 180 degrees. to go from here to here. And when I look at this, I strongly see these footprints as little hills. But when I look at this, I see these footprints as little things that hold water. Okay? Now, why is that? Why is it such a strong interpretation of these as convex and these as concave? Does anybody have an idea why? The shading, okay? It's the way that we interpret the light, okay? And what is producing the highlights and the shadows here in the figures, or in the photos? What's the source of the light? The sun. And where is the sun normally? Above. So if the sun is above, up here, and it's lighting an object such that you have the highlights here and the shadow here, how can you do that? How can you get that shadow? Can you get a shadow over here if the object were sunk in? No, you get the shadow over here if it's sticking out, right? So if you've got the footprint sticking out as a convex object, it catches the light here on the front side and produces a shadow on the back, okay? So your mind is basically saying, I'm looking at the lights and the darks to interpret whether this is convex or concave. I'm assuming that the sun is up because that's how it normally is, and hence, when I look at this object, even though I know these are footprints in the sand, I interpret them as little hills. Similarly over here, right? Sun is above, you get this highlight over here, and a shadow over here. Highlight over here, shadow over here. What can produce that? Well, a little sort of gully, something that sticks in, because the sunlight here would hit this edge, but produces a shadow at that edge there. Okay? Does that make sense? Dominic, does that make sense? You seem like you're frowning.
I'm trying to see the gullies. I can see the hills.
You can see the hills, but you can't see the gullies. Okay.
Kind of mind bending. I like it though.
Okay. Like I said, the way that I interpret this is I interpret, again, the sun is coming from above, and if you've got something which is like a bowl, right? The sun would hit, this side of the bowl, but not that side.
Yeah, so I see it sort of as a raised, the heel part is raised and it's going down, but it's still above the surface. And I see it in both, see it that way in both of them. I can't see it.
Okay. Okay.
I understand what it's supposed to be saying. My brain just can't see it.
Okay. Do other people see a distinction between convex and concave? Now, actually, a practical matter, from what I've been told, something similar happened with with employees at NASA in regard to some images that they had of the moon. And they were looking at images like this, and one of the engineers says, look, there are actually little hills on the moon. And the other engineer says, no, Bill, that's not the case. And he turned the photo 180 degrees and said those are just craters, like we normally see. Okay. So you can see how there is this ambiguity, and what breaks the ambiguity, at least for most of us, is the assumption that the sun is overhead, and then we're using light logic, if you will, to decide. Okay. What about this? What do you see here? A convex or concave head? Do you see a normal head? Okay. So this is a mask, a Halloween mask of Obama, actually, okay, which I had painted white. Okay, so I got this a couple of years ago. Okay, here it is, right here. Okay. But the photo that you're seeing here is the photo of the inside. Okay? Now, to illustrate that, let me show you here. Okay, so I don't know if you need to darken the lights, but let me do a demonstration here.
You want me to dim more?
Yeah, just a little bit for this one. Or maybe not, maybe it's okay. Okay, yeah, that's probably. Okay, so I'm going to sort of light it up a little bit. Okay, now, can you see it? Okay, now, to make the effect a little bit stronger, just close one of your eyes so you lose some of the depth perception that you have with the two eyes. And then to make it look really cool, you should sort of stand up and you just move a little bit to the left and to the right. Okay, so I recommend that you do that. And the more you move to the left or the right,
With one eye?
well, just look at it with one eye, okay, just to get and what do you see? What do you see when you move to the left?
It's following.
And it follows you. It follows you in a way that a normal head would not follow you.
Yeah.
Right? So when you walk, say, from, in this direction here, you're not seeing the other side of the head that you would, but the head effectively turns and follows you along. Yes?
Is that why sometimes when you're in like museums or whatever looking at art, it sometimes feels like the picture is like almost looking at you?
Oh, I know what you're saying. I don't know if it's the same thing. But this is, this here is a sort of a three-dimensional thing, right? So we are talking about concave versus convex. But the fact that it's following you here is because I've oriented this way, the concave way. If I turn it normally, you wouldn't, right? If you want to just see it, if I turn it like this, okay, and you walk around, you would see what you normally,
Right.
what you normally see, okay? Right?
Oh, yeah.
Whereas if I turn it like this,
Then it's different.
it's different. And even when you go to the extreme, like 45 degrees or more, it's, okay? So this is, again, this concave, convex sort of ambiguity, which one sort of breaks by assuming that either the sun is overhead or that faces are actually convex, right? We don't normally see people with concave heads. Okay? Now here's a print of Escher's, which again talks about the difference between concave and convex, okay? It's a very complicated figure, as many of Escher's prints are. Okay, so let's just look at first at the left-hand side. Okay, now you see this lady here. She's walking over some bridge. Okay, there's somebody in a little canoe going over. Okay, so you would interpret this as convex. Okay, that's a convex shape. Here's a little boy or man sitting next to this structure here. There's some doorways. So here, these little bumps here, you interpret again as convex, sticking out. Okay? A plant on a windowsill, convex here. Convex. Got somebody climbing up a ladder. There's a little staircase here. So these are sort of convex. They stick out. Okay? Now, if you look, though, at this pillar, is that convex or concave? It's concave if you look here, right? If you say, well, this is the wall of a building, this is the other wall, and you look down here, you see that the pillar is actually, it's a false pillar, if you will, right? There's no pillar there, okay? And similarly, next to the boy, you've got this little shell, which I would interpret as a gully, like a footprint in the sand, something that's concave. So most of the structures here are convex, but you have a few concave things. Okay? Now if you concentrate instead on the other side of the print, what do you have? Okay? Well, here you've got this trumpet player in this room of some building. So this here must be an arch. Right? So this is an arch. So that's concave. Okay? This here looks like, right, you've got somebody climbing the stairs. This looks like the ceiling, right? It's the ceiling below this guy here. And you've got a little lantern hanging off the ceiling. This is the corner of the room. So there's like an inverted sort of staircase in the corner here. And this little shell shape here, at least the way that I interpret it, I interpret this as convex, something sticking out, one of these embossed things on the ceiling. So you've got the ceiling, you've got this lantern hanging on the ceiling, and then you've got sort of like a shell sort of sticking out, okay? And then, again, you've got this gecko climbing up, sort of like climbing up this way, this inverted staircase here, okay? So on this side of the print, most of the things are concave, although there are a few convex things, this being convex, at least to me. What about the pillar here? If you look at the pillar, do you see that as convex or concave?
Is that really there?
Is that really there? Well, again, the way that, I mean, it's hard, right? Because Escher is just playing with our minds here, right? So the way that I interpret it is, this is like a ceiling here. This is a corner of a room, right? This is one wall, this is the other. And hence, this is sticking out, okay? So this would be a real pillar for me, right? So this is the base of the pillar. Whereas the other pillar that we looked at on the other side is a false or concave pillar. Now, if you put both of these together, in the middle here, all screwy things happen, right? So you get the ambiguity is particularly strong, okay? Because here, how do you interpret this thing? Is this one of these false pillars? So concave for this guy and convex for that. How do you interpret that? And I think it depends on whether or not you focus your attention to the right or you focus your attention to the left. Same thing here, right? Do you interpret this here as a floor or a ceiling? If you look at this guy here, you say, well, it's obviously a floor. If you look at this hanging lantern, you say, obviously, it's a ceiling, right? What about this? Is this a staircase? Well, it is a staircase if you think of this as the floor, right? The boy walks over here, goes up the staircase. But I thought we said that staircase is actually part of the arch underneath the boy here. Okay? Yes?
So I see a mirror plane right in the middle of it.
Yes.
With two different like light sources or two different sort of shadings on either side.
I think that's right. I mean, so if you split it two ways, I think if you look at this or you look at the one before, there's really no ambiguity, or things are very, very well defined here. This is a floor. This is something sticking in. This is a false pillar. This is something you can climb up on. This is something you can climb up on. This is a bridge, okay? And similarly on the right side, okay? So like you said, you divide it in half. The way that the light is shining defines whether the structures are convex or concave.
So it's like an impossible light source.
Yeah, that's right. It's just right. I mean, and that's the thing is that if you just draw if you draw a circle on a page, what do you represent? Is it a disc? Is it a sphere? Is it sticking out? Is it sticking in? It depends on how you interpret the shading, right? You have to shade and you have to interpret that. I mean, if you look at this here, if you stare at it for a while, it flips back and forth. I mean, it hurts my head sometimes just looking at it, because either you can look at the gecko, this gecko here is climbing up like a staircase. Okay, sort of a normal staircase, low to high. But then if you look sort of this way, this gecko is climbing like this here, right? This is the corner of a room, and then this structure sticks out. So again, it's going in or out depending on how you're interpreting other things around it, and You can't see both at the same time. Okay? It's just an exaggerated form of the base versus faces thing that we looked at originally. Okay, so let me move, given that time is running out, the last topic, impossible objects. This is a print of Escher's called Man with Cuboid. And he's holding a cube, which Escher invented, which unfortunately you can't make. It's an impossible cube. Okay. Now, it turns out that this impossible cube is closely related to something that you may have heard about called the Necker cube. Necker was actually a Swiss crystallographer, Louis Albert Necker, who was studying crystals and making line drawings of different crystal structure. And he basically drew this. Okay? So if you just look at this, to me it looks just like diamonds and things like that, just a flat two-dimensional shape. Okay? But if you just rotate it by 45 degrees, you get this, which looks like a cube seen in perspective. But this is not a proper linear perspective drawing of a cube, because remember, for proper linear perspective, same size edges should shrink as they move away from you. So if this edge is further away from this, it should actually be represented by a shorter line. And here, all of the lines are the same length. Okay, so it's a simple line drawing of a cube. And because all of the lines are the same length, there's an ambiguity in how we interpret this cube. Do you see the cube with this as the front face here? Or this is the front face? It switches, right? Again, it flip-flops back and forth depending on your mind, right? You can't see both at the same time. Now, the ambiguity is basically related to these two edges, edge number 1 and edge number 2. If you bring edge number 1 to the front and you put edge number 2 to the back, then this becomes the front face, okay? If you move edge number 1 to the back and you move edge number 2 to the front, then this becomes the front face here, okay? So those two possibilities, 1 to the front and 2 to the back, or 1 to the back and 2 to the front, correspond to the two different ways that you can see the cube. Now, there's nothing impossible about that. What becomes impossible is when you try to put both of those edges either to the front or to the back. Okay, so the solid lines mean they come toward the front, and the dotted lines means they're pushed to the back. So again, here, the dotted lines, you're pushing those edges to the back. Now, it's hard to see that these are impossible objects. I mean, maybe you can see that with these simple line drawings, but if you just sort of thicken the lines a bit, it becomes more easily noticeable as an impossible object. So when these two edges are to the front, it looks like this. When the two edges, 1 and 2, sit behind the other edges, it's an impossible object. Okay, so you can have either ambiguity or impossibility. Okay. Now, this is a print of Escher's called Belvedere. We can come back to it at the end of the talk if you want. But there's a lot of impossibility in this particular figure, which we can look at. But if you look closely, here's the man with cuboid sitting down here. But there are also some weird things about this figure which we can push till after the talk. I'll just point out one, that the guy starts here on the ladder inside the building, yet somehow winds up outside over there. So it's a weird print. We can come back to it later if anybody wants. Here's another impossible object, okay, called the impossible tribar. Okay, it's like a triangle, and it was invented, if you will, by Roger Penrose, who's a mathematician / physicist. Okay, and he wrote this paper with his father, Lionel Penrose, a polymath who did mathematics and other things as well. And it was published in the British Journal of Psychology in 1958. And this was written after both Lionel and Roger went to the International Congress of Mathematicians in Amsterdam, a big meeting in 1954. At the time, Escher had an exhibition. This was before Escher was well known. And the two Penroses went to the exhibition. They saw Escher's print Relativity, which we looked at earlier, and they were really intrigued by that, the impossibility of that relativity scene. And they said, well, let's go home and try to invent our own impossible objects, okay? So Roger came up with this one, impossible tribar, and Lionel came up with another one, which I'll show you in just a bit. But even though it's impossible, I built one myself, okay? And I've got one here. I'll show it to you later if you want. It's just sort of sitting here on the desk, okay? This is my impossible tribar, okay? And here's a tribar, sort of two interlocking tribars. So you've got the tribar outside and then another tribar inside. And if you just sort of follow your nose, if you will, and you consider what's happening locally, and you follow that arrow, follow that arrow, follow that arrow, follow that arrow, you can interpret this as just moving horizontally back in space along a zigzag line. But what happens is that you actually end up much higher than where you started. So even though it doesn't look like you've made a step up when you make this turn here or you make this turn here, these local movements here actually lead to something that's globally much higher at the end than what it was when it started. Okay? And Escher used this. Okay, so Escher in his print Waterfall used this double tribar in order to represent this perpetual motion waterfall, if you will, where the water sort of flows slightly downhill from the water wheel back up to the top and then back down. Okay? So this print here, Waterfall by Escher, was actually motivated by the article by the two Penroses. Okay? And then this is the other impossible object that Lionel Penrose came up with. It's an impossible staircase because it always goes up. It's never ending. You walk up and up and up. Right? It's a never-ending staircase. You continually go up or you continually go down depending on if you're going counterclockwise or clockwise. Okay? Now you can make one of these at home if you want, okay? So here's a photo of one that I made, and I've got it over here if you want to look at it, okay? Now, you have to imagine going up the different steps here. And Escher used this impossible, never-ending staircase in his print Ascending and Descending, okay? So if you look here at the top, this is I think this is like a monastery with these hooded figures. Think of these as monks, if you will. And these monks are, if you go this way here, they're walking down the staircase, but they're never getting anywhere. Those monks going this way are continually walking uphill, never getting anywhere. So they're in this state of endless penance, if you will, never to go anywhere, except for these two monks over here, who decide not to participate in this activity. Okay. So let me just summarize, given that time is up. So as I said at the beginning, there's this fundamental ambiguity that exists in interpreting what we see on a two-dimensional page as a three-dimensional object. And Escher basically used that ambiguity to fool us when we looked at some of his prints, which I show here. If you want to learn more about Escher and the stuff that he does, I recommend some books and some web resources. There's this book called The Magic Mirror of M.C. Escher, which I have here. You can take a look at. It's written by Escher. It's written by a mathematician, Bruno Ernst, who interviewed Escher the last few years of Escher's life. And then there's this website called Escher Math, which is really good if you want to understand more mathematical aspects of Escher's work. Okay, so I'll stop there, and if you want to ask questions or come up and look at things, or just let me know.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any questions?
Yeah, I don't know what that.